Hello, everyone, and welcome to our ninth episode this season of Space Law webinars at the Law, Technology, and Warfare Research Cell at the U.S. Air Force Academy. I'm Major Matt Ormsbee, and I'm pleased to bring you another webinar on space law and policy today. For our ninth webinar of the season, we're very excited today to welcome Dr. Wendy Whitman Cobb. Dr. Whitman Cobb is Professor of Strategy and Security Studies at the School of Advanced Air and Space Studies, or SAASS, at Air University, Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. Dr. Whitman Cobb received her bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Central Florida, both in political science, and a PhD in political science from the University of Florida. Her research focuses on the political and institutional dynamics of space policy, public opinion of space exploration, and commercial space. Dr. Whitman Cobb's work has been published in Space Policy, Astropolitics, Congress and the Presidency, Strategic Studies Quarterly, and the Journal of Political Science Education. Most recently, she is the co-author of Space Policy for the 21st Century, published just this year by the University of Florida Press. This publication is a first-of-its-kind space policy textbook. We're very honored to welcome her today as she addresses her newest research on a possible commercial space security dilemma. As we go along, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the box or chime in, and we'll try to reserve time at the end to answer all of your questions. Dr. Whitman Cobb, thank you again so much for being with us today. At this time, I'll turn it over to you and let you begin your presentation. Over to you, ma'am.
Thanks, Matt. Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be talking to a USAFA group. I spent 2 months out there in fall of 2022, the semester that was infamously delayed by computer issues. I actually had a great opportunity afforded to me by the Department of Political Science to test drive the book that is now out, Space Policy for the 21st Century. I got to teach a shortened space policy course over the course of 2 months. So I'm really thrilled to be able to sort of bring this all full circle. And actually, the origins of this paper, I had this idea when I was out there. So this really is a lot of full circle for me in sort of bringing this all back around and getting to talk about it to you all. So really thrilled to have this opportunity today. Like Matt said, I'll be talking about my recent article in Ether, formerly known as Strategic Studies Quarterly, about a commercial space security dilemma. I'm going to pull up my slides here. Woohoo, it worked this time. And talk about it. Obviously, got to start with the typical government disclaimer. All views are my own, not necessarily representative of DoD or the Air Force, but here we go. So all the legalities undertaken. Just a quick overview. I'm going to try and keep this really fun for me to get to do. The argument I present in this piece is that we're clearly building on a lot of commercial uses of space and for very good things. It's funny, when I first started studying space policy, longer than I care to remember now, this was pre-SpaceX's grand successes. And so when I was being brought up in this field, there was no way a commercial space company was ever going to succeed. And I think it's fair to say we've all had to eat our words since then. And we've seen a lot of great benefits from it. That being said, I think we are starting to see some really significant ramifications with growing use of commercial space that I think we need to seriously think about. And so some authors, myself included, in a previous book, have suggested that utilizing more commercial space capabilities might actually be a good way of sort of tamping down any potential security stressors, let's say, in the space domain, because it sort of communicates to potential adversaries that we're not out to use space for more aggressive purposes, more for peaceful purposes, more for civilian or just sort of neutral type activities. However, I think we're starting to get to a place that, and I'll talk about why here in a second, that commercial space activities, especially when the government is contracting them, are really just becoming a thin veneer for military action. And so instead of alleviating security dilemma like tensions, we're just really shifting it. So we're not changing the game. The security dilemma still exists. We're just moving which arena it's being played in. So we're moving from state to state to commercial and economic. And so that's the basis of what I'm arguing here today. So I'll kind of run through my article here, some different variations on the security dilemma, what I see as setting up as the commercial space security dilemma, some evidence we see from US-China relations, and some implications and recommendations. And I put a particular legal spin on it that wasn't necessarily in the article. So, I hope you will bear with a non-lawyer for speaking about such things. I'm a little bit nervous, so please go easy on me. To start off with, obviously, I'm drawing here on a large literature in international relations about security dilemmas, otherwise known as arms races. The idea of the basic security dilemma being when one country arms itself or takes actions that could appear to be potentially offensive, even if those moves are meant in a defensive manner. Another state might rationally look at that and see that as a threat to their own security, and in turn arm themselves, which leads us into this vicious cycle of arming, and arms races that we have seen in the past, particularly in the nuclear realm. There are some other variations on this that have been presented in the literature. One, an economic security dilemma. This focuses, as you would guess, much on economic power, particularly since we do tend to see it as a latent form of military power and a very, very important part of national power. And that really revolves around protecting economic security. And I think we've seen a lot of moves in recent years that sort of, especially with the United States and China, are sort of shoring each country up on that element. So one country looks to protect itself, which other countries see as threatening. And so you can see this security dilemma playing out just with economic matters rather than military. Technology security dilemmas have also been identified. We see this, some scholars have seen this in terms of AI, this whole competition for developing artificial intelligence or semiconductors or protections of supply chains. So seeing that as a vital part of space power, or not space power, but national power. Private military security dilemma has also been identified in the literature, and obviously this one has to do with states using private military services in lieu of their own state military services. This tends to be in the literature a little bit more regional of an issue. Think Asia, think Africa, but as I said, there do seem to be very similar dynamics there. And then finally, dual use security dilemma. This one I think is really interesting because it's not just about countries, one country developing dual use, another seeing it as threatening and therefore developing their own dual use technologies and therefore the cycle starting. But this also has become part of a securitization discussion. And by securitization, I mean the process by which we come to label something as potentially dual use. The sort of international relations theory realm, we can kind of get into this idea of constructivism, that ideas really are what we make of them. So if we don't make something look dual use and put that label on it, essentially, maybe it's not. It's just really in the eye of the beholder. So securitization is the process through which we come to label things as potentially dual use and threatening. And so there does seem to be a little bit of back and forth about that in the literature, not super extensive at this point, but right now that's sort of where this typology sits. And in thinking about commercial space, the idea being one country builds up its commercial space sector, sees very, very big strategic benefits from it. Another country sees that as threatening, builds up their own, and therefore we get this cycle. I think you see some similar things here in these variations. However, I would argue that a commercial space security dilemma is distinct from these. Of these, I think the two that are most like what we're about to talk about are private military and dual use. But I would still say commercial space is distinct for a few reasons. First, with respect to private military, services, the barrier to entry for that is much lower than it is for a commercial space company. And so in a sector such as that, we're likely to see much more competition. And so more competition, more companies competing. The other thing is that states are not the only or the primary customer for private military services, like we will see with the commercial space security dilemma here. And finally, that does tend to be a little bit more regional focus compared to commercial space and space generally, which does take on a little bit more of a global great power competition type angle. So I would argue that even though I'm sort of drawing from this literature and there are very much, I think, parallels with all of these different aspects, I would argue that the commercial space security dilemma is unique and distinct for reasons I'm about to touch on, and therefore leads to distinct consequences stemming from it that are different from what we see in these basic ideas. So why do I think that is? Why do I think a commercial space security dilemma is unique? A couple things, three big bins of categories. First, obviously, just the uniqueness of the physical environment in space. It is far away. It is difficult to operate in. It's still somewhat expensive to get there. Not everybody can do it. And so there's a lot of those types of difficulties, just even operating in space, that really contribute a lot to the second category of factors that I just sort of terming uncertainty. Uncertainty is one of an ambiguity are really really at the heart of security dilemmas, I would argue. Because what's driving state B to arm itself is uncertainty about state A's intentions. And so if that's what's lying at the heart of a security dilemma, there is so many sources of uncertainty in the space domain that I think we would be hard pressed to avoid having a security dilemma in space because of that. And in terms of space, not only are we talking about uncertainty of dual use capabilities or what a country intends to do with a space asset, or what is happening with a satellite up in space. Let's just say, a satellite starts acting wonky, goes down, we don't automatically necessarily know why it's malfunctioning. It could be a micrometeoroid. It could be a piece of debris. It could be an intentional attack. But that's not going to be known probably right away. And in some cases, maybe not at all. So it's very hard for us to have really good space situational or space domain awareness, whichever the terminologies you choose to use. My students just had a debate over that. So which one to use, I leave it up to the user here. So attribution is really difficult. Identity of users. This is unique for commercial space assets. And I think it gets at the heart of one of the really key problems with commercial space security dilemmas. We know that some countries are using Starlink, for instance. We know Ukraine is, we know the United States is. Russia has said we see Starlink as a potential target because we know that Ukraine is using it. Let's just say Ukraine or the United States or any other country straight out publicly denies, no, we are no longer using Starlink. I think the chances of Russia or any other country believing that, probably low. And so, one of the problems here, especially with commercial space capabilities, commercial space assets, it's not just the satellite's purpose that could be uncertain. That goes to the dual use issue. It's not just the intent that could be unclear. It's also the identity of the user, as well as the number of uses that satellite could be used for. Starlink clearly isn't just, facilitating communications, but also drone attacks. So with commercial space capabilities, there are multiple uses that are all entirely unclear. All could be happening at the same time. And, our ability to believe any particular actor and what they say they are using a satellite for or not using a satellite for is really going to be very iffy. And so I think there's a lot of ambiguity involved here. And I think that is distinct from when we think about state-owned satellites. Yes, there are some state-owned and operated satellites whose purpose and intent are unclear. However, if we know that the state government owns them, I think we're a little bit more certain about the potential uses compared to a commercial operator and their customers who could be using it for any number of purposes. So I think there's a lot more uncertainty involved with commercial space. The other big factor here is the state of the market. Yes, the commercial space industry is growing, particularly here in the United States, but it remains the case in the United States and elsewhere that states are the single most important customer of commercial space capabilities. And if tomorrow all government contracts were to go away, I'm not sure we would have very many survivors of that. And I think that is important because it signals to other potential adversaries that the government is using this mostly. That if you parcel it out and say, let's just say the government constitutes 60% of the customers on a particular satellite, well, then it's probably going to be more clear that it's a state function rather than a commercial function. And so I think as long as governments and states remain a primary customer or the most important customer here, it continues to drive this argument that we're not alleviating any security tension. We're just moving it to a different venue. So basically, here's my idea of a commercial space security dilemma in brief. State one supports a commercial market, purchases services capabilities, and finds strategic advantage. All of these things have been happening in the United States. The United States has undertook significant efforts since the 1980s to support a commercial space market for lots of reasons. That's only really happened in the past 15 to 20 years. But we have definitely seen the benefits of this in terms of reduced costs, greater pace of innovation, certainly more uses, more ability to get to space, all of these great things that really make us all excited about commercial space that are all really great things. However, on the flip side, all of this ambiguity, uncertainty, strategic advantage, and lack of alternative customers means state two is going to see that commercial space sector as a potential threat. And as a result, will support their own market, purchases, services, capabilities, find strategic advantage. And again, this cycle starts all over again. And I think one of the important implications that comes out of this is that it really does change what it means to be a space power. Up until this point in time, to be a space power on the global stage meant that you had independent space capabilities. Now, almost anybody could be a space power because they can purchase that. And so, if we think of, there's a great book, I'm sure many of you know, Power of the Space Club. My students read it this year. So if we take, the idea of a space club being those states that have space capabilities, well, if every state can have space capabilities, there's no specialness left in the club. So what we might be seeing develop is a new kind of club where the really important space power comes from being a commercial space power and having the companies within your country that can sell their services to others. And so, it's not a major theme of this article, but I do think it's an important implication that potentially comes out of this. So turning just briefly to sort of some evidence that we see for this, I didn't want to give off the appearance of being sort of a stalker-esque cutting pages out of a magazine, but I thought headlines might be one of the best ways to sort of illustrate this for a couple of reasons. So let's start with remote sensing capabilities that we're getting from the commercial market. You see some headlines there in terms of internet sleuths looking for China's Uyghur internment camps, or their missile silo construction. These are stories that relied on commercial remote sensing capabilities. And the strategic advantage that the United States gets out of this is the ability to uncover bad actors without having to divulge sources and methods. In the past, countries like China or Russia might have been able to think that I can get away with doing bad things because the United States certainly wouldn't publicize it, because then it would give away what kinds of capabilities that they have. That's no longer an issue. And so we definitely saw a really great example of this in the run-up to Russia's invasion in Ukraine, and utilizing that type of remote sensing imagery to really pre-butt what Russia was doing. And we continue to see the use of these types of remote sensing capabilities as well in the Middle East recently as well. So these remote sensing commercial capabilities have been really, really important to building this strategic advantage. Starlink has also been, another key factor here in Ukraine and elsewhere. China certainly sees them as a threat. In a lot of their writings and reports that have come out from China, there have been speculations as to uses of Starlink for missile warning and tracking, which we don't believe is actually happening with Starlink. But certainly the capabilities that Starlink has provided in Ukraine have made an impression not just here in the United States, but on others elsewhere, and the ability that that has to really give countries and even non-state actors some really significant amounts of power. And so China is deeply alarmed by Starlink. In the past, so it was definitely early March, there was a more stories out about Starshield, which will be the military version of Starlink that SpaceX is continuing to develop. Both Russia and China came out after that report and said, this is basically threatened Starlink once again. We already know that SpaceX has curbed Ukrainian access to Starlink in certain places for certain purposes, because supposedly being told by Russia that it would really start off a wider conflagration. And so we know that our adversaries are seeing these types of capabilities as giving us strategic advantage. And one thing I do think it's important to note, a lot of this hinges on commercial SATCOM, satellite communications, and SATCOM is one of the capabilities that has been commercialized almost from the very beginning in the 1960s. And so, obviously one of the plausible counter arguments to what I'm presenting here is, well, that's always been commercialized. Why is this just now a thing? And to that, I would say it's the mega constellation element of it. It's the fact that it's not just reliant on a single satellite or a few satellites, but the thousands that make the system then very redundant, very resilient. SpaceX has also demonstrated their ability to withstand cyber attacks. And so, it's a very, very robust system that it will likely be very hard for an adversary to take out completely should they want to. So if we think about stage 2 of the commercial space security dilemma, that would be China response. And for the purposes of this piece, I should have said earlier, I am focusing mostly just on US and China. Certainly, I don't want to minimize Russia here. They do remain a space power, even though they do seem to be declining. They also don't seem to have as robust a commercial space industry as they once had. Certainly, sanctions that have been levied on them in the past couple of years are definitely taking their toll. But for our purposes here, just for simplification's sake, just focusing on US and China. But clearly, China has seen fit to respond in several ways. One is in supporting the development of a commercial space industry, which I think, and I think this piece actually tells us a lot. For a communist country or a country with communism with Chinese characteristics, however we want to phrase it, the fact remains that state-owned enterprises remain heavily involved in their economy just generally. And so you would think, particularly in an authoritarian regime, that if they want to build up a particular capability, they don't need to go to a commercial company to really do that or seek that out. They can just as easily and perhaps more easily just direct a state agency, state organization to do it. So I think it's really important. This is a really big piece to the puzzle here that tells us something. It tells us that China sees a threat in our commercial space industry and is responding to it by building up their own commercial space industry. And they've been doing this since 2014 specifically. And so we can see, we don't have a ton of great data, unfortunately, on the Chinese commercial space industry. There is a really great Institute for Defense Analyses report that looks at their industry. Unfortunately, it's a few years old now. But what is clear is that their funding has been increasing, the number of commercial space companies has been increasing, their capabilities have been increasing. They've definitely been responding. They've been seeking to build out their own Starlink-like system. They have been seeking to challenge the U.S. space industry. So I think there's a lot of evidence here that tells us that China is worried. China is seeing the benefits and strategic advantages that the United States is getting from commercial space, and is finding out that they need to go out and do the same thing. And to this point of why, I will, turn to the IDA report here. They really identify and argue that the reason China wants to do this is for the exact same reasons that we want to. We want the innovation, we want the reduced cost, we want the economic benefits. And so I think, I think that's actually really fascinating to me that China, an authoritarian state that, again, arguably could just direct its state apparatus to do something, is seeing a benefit and can see why a commercial space industry might be a good thing strategically. And we certainly see evidence that they're succeeding in this. We are seeing reports that their commercial space industry is advancing very quickly. No, they haven't quite gotten to reusable rockets yet, like we have with SpaceX or other providers, but they're getting there and getting there very quickly. And I think that sort of follows along with what we see elsewhere in Chinese space developments. It's not necessarily that they can do something or can't do something. It's the pace at which they've been able to get there compared to us in particular. And so finally, if we think about the stage 3, U.S. recognizes the threat and responds and return. Again, we see evidence of that as well. We've seen it in civilian spaceflight with the Artemis project. Especially during the Trump administration, one of the major drivers of Artemis was we need to go to the moon because China wants to go to the moon. We've also seen concerns about leaving low Earth orbit to China should we deorbit the ISS in 2030 and not have something to go backfill it with. We see the Space Force recognizing, and they have since they were stood up, the value of commercial space. They released their first commercial space strategy earlier this month. The DoD sees this as a threat. We're doing all of these things to not just bolster our space industry and get the benefits of it, but also to compete with China. And so I think there's a lot of, this is again selective. I think there's probably about a dozen more different kinds of stories that I could have cited too. But I think this really does say a lot in terms of what is happening on the ground. And so implications. I think there's a few, somewhat contradictory in some ways too. One, this might be a better dilemma to have compared to a traditional arms-oriented security dilemma. Qualitative, if we think about qualitative versus quantitative arms races, qualitative arms races can lead to really, technological developments, can lead to spin-offs, things that might advance us a little bit further than just number of guns on the shelf. And so I think if we think about this in that sense, that rather than investing in strictly military technology or capabilities, if we can also invest in the economic element too, where we're getting the benefit of technological innovation and lower costs, but we're also then being able to compete. This actually might be a better dilemma to have overall in the long term, especially since the US, I think, is better poised to compete in that type of arms race long term. One of the very first books my early space mentor, Dr. Roger Hamburg, loaned me and had me read was a book from the 1990s called Can Democracies Fly in Space? And it has stuck with me for a long time. And I think this is one of the reasons that, because the argument in that book is that democracy, democratic government, because of the budgeting cycles, the way in which we're not incredibly certain year to year, how much things like space is going to get, especially since space is a long-term, expensive type endeavor. WDK, the author of this book, makes the argument that, maybe authoritarian countries would be better off doing these types of things because we're just not set up to do long-term technological development here in the United States. And while that might have been true in the 1990s when there really wasn't much of a commercial space industry to speak of, nowadays, where we have a commercial space industry, the US has a economic regulatory framework while still being built for commercial space is probably better poised to compete long term. One of the hurdles that the IDA analysis of Chinese commercial space identifies is China doesn't really have that. There's still not a lot of legal or regulatory clarity for Chinese companies. And so I think, in this type of race, the US might be better poised to compete. That all being said, clearly, if we start to use more commercial services for military purposes, there is a danger to industry partners. Russia has threatened to target commercial satellites. Clearly, SpaceX responded by, sort of backing off in certain places. And I think that's understandable. These capabilities are things that these companies are investing a lot of money in. The last thing they want to do is waste that money or see it go to naught or destroy the low Earth orbit environment with thousands of pieces of debris to an extent that they can't operate there anymore. And so, there is a clear danger to industry partners that I think the DoD and the Space Force is starting to recognize. But we probably need to do better in sort of finding ways to mitigate that and not just identify it. If I had one problem with the commercial space strategy that came out, it's probably that. One of the lines of efforts is risk management, but it's really more about risk communication than it is mitigation. So I could certainly talk about that later, though, if anybody would like. In terms of deterrence, clearly there is a benefit to utilizing more commercial space capabilities to deterrence in creating more resilient, redundant space architectures. However, I think there might be some evidence here that commercial actors might be more deterrable than state actors, given what SpaceX has already done. So I think there might be some elements there to potentially think about in terms of deterrence. But at the end of the day, I still think, my students ask, I got this question because, my book, I sort of argue that, the more we do to commercialize space, create more interdependence, particularly between space capabilities and the global economy, the better, because it raises the cost of potential conflict in space. They asked me, have I changed my mind? I don't think so. I think commercial forces may still help to reduce tension compared to the original security dilemma. But I do think we need to start thinking about these long-term potential consequences of just shifting the security dilemma somewhere else. So I'm still optimistic. I'm still, I'm still incredibly supportive of the commercial space industry in terms of what it's doing, what it's developing, what it's contributing, what its potential is. But I think we need to start thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead. And I don't see evidence much to date that we have been. So thinking about going forward, I think one of the best things that we could do if we want to kind of think about tamping this down, because we probably do, I don't think any of us want to see the space environment, destroyed through conflict. I think one of the things that we can do is grow the market and diversify the customer base, encourage greater interdependence and independence. And what do I mean by that? Well, one, if having the government as the primary customer is one of the things that's driving this, giving space companies more customers, specifically non-state customers, might give them a little bit more leverage to pull away from state contracts. So if SpaceX today said no more government contracts, I doubt very much that, of all the companies, they might be able to survive, but at the end of the day, they're still getting a significant line of revenue from government contracts. But if all of a sudden, let's say 60% of a space company's customers were non-state actors, maybe you could say you feel a little bit better about not competing for government contracts because you had an assured source of revenue from elsewhere. And then you could basically start to have a little bit more very plausible deniability in terms of who is using your commercial space capabilities. Encourage greater interdependence. Again, this kind of goes back to an argument I made a few years ago in my book, more interdependence between the global economy and space capabilities. When you do that, it increases the cost of space conflict for everybody because you can't restrict the ramifications to one state or the other. It's almost mutually assured, not destruction, but the dependence, maybe a better term. So if we can find ways to give space companies a little bit more independence, I think that from government customers in particular, I think that would be a good step forward. In thinking about us here in the United States, if we are going to continue down this path, I think we need to give some more thought or continuing thought to appropriate regulatory schemes for government support. We've done pretty well so far. However, I think we're starting to see the places where this is significantly lacking. We've made progress in the past couple of years in terms of designating Department of Commerce as our space traffic management sort of central, moving that from space, or moving especially SSA, SDA from the military over to commerce. That is still a process that is ongoing, that has been somewhat underfunded by the Congress, much like other civilian space activities. So, we probably need to give some more regulatory thought to those types of activities. Novel use frameworks have been something that the National Space Council has been thinking about, Congress has been thinking about. As we start to use commercial space capabilities in new ways, who's going to license that? Who's going to verify it? Who's going to oversee it? If we think about all the things that the Space Force identifies in their commercial space strategy as them wanting to do, particularly in terms of on-orbit logistics and rendezvous and proximity operations. If we had some test satellites in terms of debris mitigation and remediation, those are things that are going to need to be approved, and having a way of doing that is not bogged down in tons of regulations and takes months on end, I think would also help support a commercial space industry that can compete on a global scale and continue to compete on a global scale. Another thing, I sort of like to muse about is are we headed for a future where we need to consolidate a lot of these regulatory functions into a single agency? One of the things I actually find really fascinating is there's a lot of parallels between the state of commercial space today and the state of commercial aviation in the 1920s and 1930s. And over the course of those interwar decades, different agencies throughout the government sort of picked up different aviation functions, and eventually it got to a point where it needed to be consolidated. And so right now, if we think about all the different agencies that are involved between the FCC, the Department of Commerce, the Department of Transportation, the FAA underneath that, it might be at a point where we need to start thinking about how to consolidate this in a one-stop shop for space. And of course, that brings with it a whole set of very complicated political dynamics. As an Americanist who studied institutions for my PhD, I am well aware of all of those implications. But I wonder if we're not getting to a point where that it's starting to become time to really seriously think about it. Liability issues, especially if we want to give commercial space companies a little bit more independence. How might we sort of think about this, not just on a domestic, but also on an international level, and sort of recognizing, and this goes along with my last point here, recognizing that commercial space companies are here to stay. And they are already setting massive precedents for what's happening in space, particularly because we don't have a lot of rules of the road yet. And I wonder if this is the time to start thinking about more formal or informal means of encouraging their participation at both the domestic legal level and the international legal level. Obviously, we still live in an international regime where states, it is oriented around states. The Outer Space Treaty clearly orients space around states. However, these commercial companies are getting to the point where they are incredibly powerful. And it might be time to think about how to manage that and integrate that into this very, very different domain that is developing. I hate to think, I hate to put it in the sense, but if we think about Elon as the evil superpower, I mean, when you combine the amount of space power that SpaceX has with the amount of social media and media generally power that he has with his other day job, that makes for an incredibly I won't say concerning, but I think significant thing to think about. The amount of power that is being consolidated in the hands of a single individual. So I think this is something. I'm also, my students often like sort of poo-poo me when I say this. Maybe we need to start thinking about this, but it is something I think that we're going to have to contend with in not too long. SpaceX, I've seen suggestions might also be thinking again about launch at sea. And so if we get to this point where the SpaceX or another launch company is launching from a non-territorial location in the seas, that might have implications too. So again, I'm wary of going too much further into sort of those potential legal complications as a non-lawyer. However, I know enough to know that I think we need to start asking these questions before we get too far down this road and before it becomes too late to actually ask them and do anything about them. And so that's it. This article was in Ether this earlier this spring. That's the book that just came out earlier this month from my co-author Derek Frazier and I. Again, I was thrilled to be out at USAFA and test drive that with the cadets, and the book was definitely made better for it. So thank you to all of you at USAFA for doing what you do and for helping contribute to what we think turned out to be an awesome book. And I'm happy to take questions for as long as anybody cares to stick around. If you don't get a chance to ask a question or get in here with the discussion, feel free to reach out to me, my email anytime. My students will tell you I'm very quick on the email. I will respond to you as quickly as I can, usually within the hour. So please just, any day I get to talk about space is a good one. So thank you for making today a good day for me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Whitman Cobb, for your presentation and for your thoughts on commercial competition in space, all very important topics that many of us are talking about on a day-to-day basis. And I'd also add right now, we'd love to have you back out at USAFA anytime, maybe for your next book project or volume 2, or whatever you're thinking in the future. If we can sort of be your sounding board and help you with that publication process, that'd be an honor. At this point, we'll turn to questions from some of our attendees. Again, anyone can add questions if you've been holding on to them this time. Just type those in and we'll pose the questions time permitting. One person had mentioned something that, ma'am, you and I had mentioned briefly, which is the Space Force's commercial space strategy, which I think came out just this month during the Space Symposium in Colorado that was mentioned. And so I don't know if you've had a chance to look at that or do a deep dive. If you have, though, thoughts on whether it goes far enough, whether it's specific enough, ambitious enough, kind of your quick take on that policy and strategy.
Yeah, definitely have looked at it. I think it is a good start. I think there are places where clearly I think maybe we just haven't gotten to fleshing out the details yet, and I think the strategy admits it much in some points. Risk management I think is a great line of effort to have. But if you read it, it reads much more about communicating risk and identifying and communicating potential risk to commercial companies rather than mitigating it or saying that the Space Force will help to mitigate it or protect it or provide liability or say, if your satellite is destroyed, then we'll back you up. It doesn't go as far, I think, in that sense as I would like. I also think in terms of, thinking, I think it does a good job in communicating to industry. Here are the areas that we're interested in developing and purchasing commercial services. But I'd like us to sort of think more holistically about the commercial space industry and how it is used more generally and what message that sends. What does that communicate to potential adversaries? And so I don't think it's just about sort of individual capabilities. I think it's about what is that mix? What is the appropriate mix of capabilities to use that not only allows us to be innovative, be quick, be fast, be resilient, redundant, all those great things that we want our space capabilities to be, but also protects the commercial space industry as a whole, that makes sure that that industry is there tomorrow because we want it tomorrow too. And so I think I would like us to see us think a little bit, I guess, one more higher level up, not just about the individual capabilities or the purposes for which we're using them, but think about this as an overall whole. What is the right mix? What is the type of risk that we are willing to take? What is that communicating to our potential adversaries? I think, in that sense, I think one way to sort of see why that's important is, we could ask the question, what would we communicate by using foreign space commercial capabilities compared to domestic? And that might signal something very different from using domestic. Now, of course, we all want to buy American. That is a legal principle in our contract. My acquisitions officer husband would really kill me if I didn't say that. But, if we thought about, what that might communicate in purchasing services from a foreign commercial space company, that might actually communicate a little bit less aggressiveness or adversarialness on our part and get to this place that some scholars have suggested in terms of potentially alleviating the really big ramifications of security dilemmas.
Yes, ma'am, that makes sense. You had mentioned that kind of in those different phases that you talked about, China perceives our threat and then directs its state agencies to build up its own space industry to kind of rival, at least match, if not surpass ours. Do we know if China is achieving that? I think you mentioned partly through the commercial space policy, but partly through state agencies, because as we all know, it's an autocratic nation, and President Xi can sort of direct things to happen. Or is it some mixture of both, kind of state agencies, commercial businesses as well?
It's just a mixture of both,
Yeah.
of the government, democracy, of state-owned enterprises, and companies that aren't necessarily state-owned, but have roots in state-owned enterprises, whether they're owned or started by people who used to work for those state-owned enterprises and have spun off. But they all seem to have some sort of connection back to the state. So even if it's not directly a state-owned enterprise, there do still seem to be those connections back. Of course, they're even if they're not state-owned, they're still incredibly dependent on the Chinese government for approval to do anything from launch to operations, all of those things, and much like, our companies here in the United States. So again, my sense seems to be it's a mix, but even for those companies that are not directly state-owned, there's still a level of relationship there that is probably tighter than what we tend to see here in the West, generally in the United States specifically.
Mhm. You had mentioned this model of the security dilemma, and it seems to be this never-ending cycle between two states, for example, where they're always trying to match each other or exceed the next, and then that just kind of spurs the cycle to continue. Is it any different between the US and the China, where it seems like the US is always kind of ahead, China just tries to catch up, but we always are at least, one length ahead of them, as opposed to a more traditional security dilemma model?
Yeah, so this is again personal bugaboo here. Can't speak for anybody else. With sort of our rhetoric around China and space. There's I think sometimes some overblown rhetoric that China is beating us in space. I get asked this question a lot, like it's China beating us in space, or is there a space race? And I'm like, space race ended in 1969. We won. That's over. We've been there. We've done that. Also, anybody says we're going to get to the moon by X date, I would also recommend adding 10 to 15 years on that, because even here in the United States, we're terrible at predicting things. Artemis 2 is probably going to be delayed. I think sometimes our rhetoric, especially as regards China and space, gets a little overblown. And so I think, yes, to date, I think we are, if we just relegate it to space, still ahead, and probably by a fair mile. I think the concern that a lot of people have, and I do take this seriously, is the pace at which they have caught up. And it's perhaps that which is seen, and that's probably what we see probably is more threatening than the actual capabilities. I will say this in case anybody's watching this. I don't have regular access to classified information. I try not to, because I do so much forward-facing public stuff. I prefer not to have to constantly question in my head. So I'm sure somebody out there is going, but wait a minute, I've seen this in a skiff. And I'm sure you have. And I don't want to, sort of minimize that. There's definitely threats out there that I wish we would actually publicize more, so that we could make that case to the public. If there is a case to be made, make it. Let's make it. Let's have that discussion. Because, if we are thinking about ramifications for the security dilemma, misperception only continues in darkness. We need that sunshine. We need that light. We need that information in order to clear up misperceptions, in order to clear up that ambiguity. And so if we go back to what's really at the heart of a security dilemma, let's do what we can to clear that up. So please, if that is out there, please, let's get it out there. Let's declassify. I think we should do as much of that as we possibly can, because I do think that is important to think about when we think about security dilemmas. So if we going back to your original question, I know it's sort of my side tangent rock that I carry around with me. We are ahead. I think it's the pace at which they're catching up that we see as threatening, and therefore we're sort of acting proactively. I'm an American. I hope that remains to be the case. But I worry sometimes that we're not thinking far enough ahead. And knowing the politics of this country, I know we don't think far enough ahead. We're incredibly reactive rather than proactive. So I just hope that we start, and I guess that's sort of my driver at the end is, we haven't had great luck resolving security dilemmas in the past. But maybe if we can start thinking about this a little bit more before we get past the point of no return, it'll be better for all of us at the end of the day.
Absolutely. I think this is the last question, seeing the time. In your Ether article, you mentioned what many of us are tracking, of course, which is that the U.S. is relying more heavily on the commercial space companies than ever before. And you mentioned there are certainly some benefits from that. For example, maybe a safer form of security dilemma than there would otherwise be. What are some of the risks to that reliance, though? You mentioned Elon Musk, obviously, that much power and authority and influence in the hands of one person. Do we risk in the future the government abdicating control to some extent to him or to other commercial actors and CEOs that we wouldn't otherwise risk?
I do think that is a risk. I don't think this would happen today or tomorrow or 5 years down the road. But what if there is a point at which, and I could see this, at some point happening, commercial launch companies getting together and saying, we are not going to launch potentially aggressive weapons into space. And now, because the United States is solely dependent on commercial launch providers, and we need to get something up that we think is vital, we have no way of getting there. And so that is absolutely a risk. Now, do I think that might be a good thing in order to prevent bad actions in space? Yeah, I would love it actually if they did that personally. But that would put the U.S. in a very, very bad strategic position, especially since right now we've kind of thrown around the past couple of months the term monopoly in terms of SpaceX's launch capabilities, and that's not strictly true. Vulcan is coming online. Hopefully, Blue Origin will have New Glenn along here shortly. Rocket Lab had a launch yesterday. So it's not strictly true, but it is concerning because if, God forbid, something happened and there was a launch mishap for SpaceX today, that would put a considerable hurt on our access to space. So that's definitely a risk. Another risk might be that we lose sort of control over this types of technology. One of the things I actually find really fascinating, I'm sure many of the people watching know about True Anomaly, the company that former Guardians have started that are really doing rendezvous and proximity operations. And I actually find that fascinating because obviously, yes, it's nice to have for the US to have as a state capability the ability to inspect satellites. But what if a private company bought that service too and could start doing private inspections of satellites? I think definitely be some positive benefits of that in terms of kind of clearing out some of this ambiguity, especially coming from a third party. But what if all of a sudden that, sort of role or service gets shifted entirely to the private sector and not the government sector? And then the other one I tend to think about sometimes is that instead of, historically, especially during the Cold War, there was this technocratic model of technology development in the United States where the government said, this is the type of capability / technology we want, go develop it. We seem to have reversed that with space a little bit in the past couple of decades, where now the government's sort of waiting to see what happens with the commercial industry and then taking advantage of what comes along, which is great because we never know what's going to come along, but that also risks ceding that sort of capability development to somebody that doesn't have the perspective that the government does, especially in terms of national security. So we might end up missing out on capabilities that we might actually find helpful or necessary or want because we've just sort of abdicated that role entirely to the commercial sector. So I think I'm not going back to sort of my grad school days where commercial companies can never succeed. I'm not, I've definitely eaten those words. I'm not going all the way out to we need all the commercial industry all the time. I think we need to think about the healthy mix of how we best take advantage of commercial services while retaining the types of powers, capabilities, decision-making power that we need in order to protect the national security of the United States.
It's a great note to end on. Seeing that we're just about at the top of the hour, we'll wrap up for the day. Want to sincerely thank Dr. Whitman Cobb for your time this morning and for sharing your recent paper and research with us. It's a fascinating topic. It's very timely and important for all of us to be tracking. You've been out to USAFA again before, so hope we can have you out in the future again for your research or just to see some of the interesting stuff that our cadets are doing out here, which is ever changing and might be of interest to you as well. So hopefully we can have you out for that. If not that, for the Space Law Conference that we also host every spring, it'd be great to have you out for that as well. So thank you, and thank you to everyone for your attendance today. We have one more exciting speaker lined up this academic year. So please keep tuning in to our Space Law webinar, and have a great day, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.